All right, well, I think we're going to get started today. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Madison, and I'm the communications manager at the Maine Island Trail Association. And I'll be just running through a couple intro things as well as some housekeeping notes with you today. And so we're here for the event, Working and Playing on the Maine Coast, with a conversation with Tom Groening and Doug Welch. Tom is the editor of the Working Waterfront, and Doug is the executive director of the Maine Island Trail Association. And so we're just going to run through a few Zoom related housekeeping notes. So everybody is on silent today for the duration of the event. And perfect. All questions you can enter into the Q&A that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. We'll be doing a Q&A at the end of the event, or the conversation portion of the event. And if you'd just like to say hi or ask a tech-related question or something like that, you can add it into the chat, and we'd be happy to chat back or say hello back. And you can enter in questions during the whole event. We'll be going through them at the end. And so yeah, from here, I'd like to just hand it right over to Tom and Doug to start their conversation.
Hi there, Tom Groening. I am the editor of the Working Waterfront newspaper and Island Journal annual publication for the Island Institute. I've been with the Institute about 7.5 years now, and I am a refugee of the daily newspaper world. I was at the Bangor Daily News for about 14 years as a reporter and editorial writer, and before that I worked for 11 years at the Republican Journal, weekly newspaper in Belfast, and I live here in Belfast.
Hi everyone, I'm Doug Welch, Executive Director of the Maine Island Trail Association, as Madison said. And I've had the great fortune to run this organization and be in charge of this mission since 2007. And that photo that you saw is surely from 2007. A lot has changed since then, let's just say. But anyway, so this is a lot of fun for me. And I will tell you, before we get started, that the three newspapers that I never miss an issue of are the New York Times, the Portland Press Herald, and the Working Waterfront. So it's great fun to be here with Tom. And I think before we get going, are we going to see the results of the poll questions? Is that the plan? Here we go. Okay, it looks like most people are familiar with the Island Institute. A fewer are familiar with the Maine Island Trail. And there's about 15-ish% engaged with both organizations. And people are pretty split on accessing the coast. So this is useful. It's nice for us to have a little bit of an idea of who is on the phone. And then the last question, I'm sorry, I don't know if everybody can see all this, but the preponderance of people are from the mid-coast, which makes perfect sense because of course the Island Institute is located on the mid-coast, and it also is our original home at MITA. So thanks for filling in the poll. And so Tom, why don't we get things going by you kind of take us back in time to the 1980s and how all this stuff got started.
Sure, and I do want to say thank you to all who are here, because I guess we've got some pretty good numbers of people here, and I appreciate the interest. Many of you will have heard these stories before, and there are kind of two stories about how the Island Institute started. Philip Conkley and Peter Ralston were the founders, and they've each told me kind of their version of the story as to how the organization got started. Philip came to Maine as a forester, believe it or not, and was working in inland Washington County doing forestry management plans for paper companies back then. And at one point he was asked to do a forestry plan for an offshore island, I believe off Washington County. And he went out there, got dropped off by a lobsterman, and spent the day kind of cruising timber, as he calls it, and assessed what was there and so on, and spent the night. The next day, he was supposed to be picked up by the lobstermen, but it was thick fog, so he got stranded there for an extra day. And he just kind of wandered around, and he saw these cellar holes, foundation, where obviously had been many houses, and this was an uninhabited island, I should say, and evidence of industry that had been there. And so when he got back to the mainland, he went to the town office and said, what happened to this island? What happened to this community? And he discovered that, in fact, in the year 1900, there were 300 year-round island communities off the coast of Maine. And at that time, as Philip's discovering this, there were 15 year-round unbridged island communities off the coast of Maine. So that kind of charged him up to say, how do we sustain these communities? Peter's version, now you all know Peter Ralston as the photographer. He had come to Maine with Andy and Betsy Wyeth. He had been a photojournalist traveling the world in the late 60s and early 70s. And Andy and Betsy, who Peter had grown up next door to them in Pennsylvania, thought it would sort of be a grounding thing for him to be in Maine. So they bring him to Maine, and he's on Allen Island, which the Wyeths own. And Philip was there, I hope I have this accurately. Philip was there to do a forestry plan, management plan for that island, and they met and decided to start the Island Institute. And the way Peter tells the story is they thought, let's do a publication. Philip's a very good writer. Peter's a very good photographer. And Betsy said, listen, I get all these mimeographed books from organizations. Let's do it right. And she wrote, as I understand it, a very big check, and the Island Journal, which featured that iconic image of the sheep going out to an island that Peter shot, started. We're going to talk about the Hurricane Island Outward Bound School as kind of a shared foundation of both organizations. I don't know a lot about that, but I know Philip was involved. And of course, there's great examples of a community that just disappeared as cement was invented and so on Hurricane Island. And then quickly, I'll just mention the newspaper. They had started a couple newspapers, Island News and Inter-Island News. And Philip realized that the 4,500 or so year-round islanders at that time had very little political clout. So he said, let's start his line was, islanders need friends in the mainland. So he started this newspaper, the Working Waterfront, in 1993, so they would see their shared interest in protecting working waterfront. He also told me this story that he was testifying before the legislature at some issue or other that affected islands. And he said, I guess it was an inland legislator, leaned across the table and said, you mean to tell me there's people living out there in the winter? So that sort of ignorance about the island communities was what drove the Institute's formation in early years. And so now I'm going to throw this to Doug. Doug, you please explain, because I can't do this certainly, how the Island Institute was sort of an incubator, as I understand it, for the Maine Island Trail Association.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think in my own mind, in kind of the most simplistic view, Hurricane Island was out and was attracting a really interesting crowd of people who were rugged outdoor individualists and people who were interested in the geology and biology of the islands. And that spawned, my understanding was that spawned as a program, the very original Island Institute. And then within a few years, one of the projects that the Island Institute, the early Island Institute, took on was a census of the Maine uninhabited islands. This was an effort that was commissioned by the state, because the state knew, after an effort in the 1970s, they knew which islands the state now technically owned. And this again is completely islands that were not inhabited at that time. So the Island Institute was part of an effort to go out and assess the recreational potential of these islands. And one of the people involved with that was a guy named David Getchell Sr. And Dave Getchell Sr. went on to become, along with Phil Conkling, a co-founder of the Maine Island Trail. So that was, my understanding is that was in 1983. And so for several years there, Dave was working, he had been an editor and a writer of some stature in sort of the outdoor recreation and sporting publications. He had a book, a journal, a publication called Small Boat Journal. And by 1987, he was coming to this idea that there could be among these uninhabited islands a quote unquote waterway for small boats that would go from island to island. And he described it as being sort of akin to the Appalachian Trail. So this was sort of the early genesis in 1987. And then in 1988, indeed, taking 30 islands that were uninhabited, the Maine Island Trail was born. So it's a water trail that goes island to island, originally 30 starting in Portland and ending, I believe, in Jonesport. But that was how it all got started. Then, interestingly, there were, you can sort of imagine that there were two completely different sets of interests between the islands that were populated and the islands that were not populated. And the MITA folks were more inclined toward the unpopulated islands. And gradually there was a bit of a rift came to exist. And in 1993, the Maine Island Trail spun off, rather than being a program of the Island Institute, became an independent organization. So that's, it's really kind of a fascinating story. And I'm happy to say that I feel like the coast of Maine is much stronger because of these two organizations. We've never competed in any way between the two. And in fact, one of our trustees is Nick Batista, who started, when I started at the island, at the Maine Island Trail, Nick was an intern. He then went to law school, and then he went to DC and worked for Shelley Pingree, and now he's at the Island Institute, and he is a trustee of mine, and indeed one of my bosses. So, so it's fun how things have come around. So Tom, let me turn it over to you. We called this session Working and Playing on the Maine Coast. So maybe you should talk about the working part of the title.
Yeah, the working waterfront, I've certainly learned a lot more about it in my 7.5 years with the Institute. I do a presentation from time to time with PowerPoint, and when I get to the part about working waterfronts, I put up a slide of, it's the Rockland Industrial Park, and there's a parking lot, and there's a couple 18-wheeler trailers backed up to a loading dock, and the text I have over it says, "Why is he showing us a loading dock?" And I say, because that's the work, that's what the working waterfront is. It's the marine-based version of that. And then I cut to a photo of, in Lincolnville Beach, there's this little fish pier, and it's kind of hemmed in between the public beach at Lincolnville Beach and the ferry terminal. And, you know, it's this little wooden pier, and there's, you know, the big multi-100-pound bait bins there. And if you're a fisherman, if you're fishing 800 lobster traps, you've got to back down your pickup truck, back down that little ramp, angle off, and there's a hoist there, and you load your boat with bait and traps and so on. So that narrow little perch is essentially the loading dock for the working waterfront. And the number we use a lot is 20 miles. That's what's left of accessible working waterfront, is 20 miles throughout the coast of Maine, however many miles we have, depending on how you figure it. Kind of the poster child for the fight over protecting the working waterfront was in Portland, and many of us will remember this in the late 80s. Condos were built on Chandler's Wharf, and that kind of started a firestorm of effort to preserve these working waterfronts. There's if anyone's really interested in this, there's a great narrative study done by the University of Rhode Island of the Portland, Portland in the 80s, basically, when, you know, you had this dilapidated industrial waterfront, and what happened and what occurred. So one of the problems with protecting working waterfront access was that in our property tax system, we tax at the highest and best use. So if a condo can host a hotel or condos, then it's going to be taxed at that value, not as a working waterfront. But thankfully, efforts were made to have a constitutional amendment proposed. And in 2005, we voted on this constitutional amendment that changed the way working waterfront property was taxed, so that it's now taxed at the current use rather than the highest and best use. And that passed with 72%, if you can believe it, favor, yes vote, 72%. But clearly, the working waterfront problems did not go away. We've seen recently in Booth Bay Harbor, this guy, Paul Kalum, who had sold his vodka distillery business and has purchased a lot of businesses and properties in Booth Bay Harbor. And he's trying to impose his vision on the town. And he loves the town and he believes his vision is best for it. And he's looking at this 1,000+ foot stretch on the East Harbor, where there's this old motel, the kind of motel that people don't go to anymore. And he's saying, let's have it mixed use. But the problem was within that district, there's a privately owned wharf that fishermen use. So you still have these problems. And people in Booth Bay rallied and raised money and created this nonprofit, this Booth Bay Maritime Foundation, and bought and preserved this public access. But the fight continues. I mean, you have it in Portland. A couple of years ago, yet another hotel was proposed for Portland. And it's not just the loss of the footprint on the piers. It's also, fishermen have talked about the parking. You can't, the commercial street is clogged with cars and you can't get to your spot to load and unload. So it's an ongoing battle, but it's certainly something that, that we need to remain vigilant about, because it is a vital part of our economy. And so to you about what do we mean by play or recreate on the coast, and how is that, and how and why is that important?
Absolutely. So yeah, I should say, we were being sort of tongue in cheek when we called it working and playing, because I don't want to make it sound as though playing isn't serious business. Playing in this sense of the word is outdoor recreation, and outdoor recreation is actually very serious business in Maine. In fact, some of you may know that we recently created within the state the Maine Office of Outdoor Recreation, which is staffed by Carol Ann Willett, who many of you will know, and that is an indication of how important this sector is within the Maine economy. I just got some statistics recently from Carol Ann. 4.8% of the Maine economy is outdoor recreation. And that's a really large percentage when you look at the total economy of Maine. If you look across the United States, we're the third largest. That 4.8% is the third largest of any state in the country in terms of what percentage is outdoor recreation. It contributes about $3 billion a year to the Maine economy. And it supports 6.4% of jobs in Maine are associated with outdoor recreation. And it's actually a growing sector. Between 2012 and 2017, it grew by 16.6%. And that is almost double what the entire economy of Maine grew in that period of time. So outdoor recreation is really an up and coming, still relatively small, but growing sector of the Maine economy. When we try to, within MITA, of course, we're always wondering, well, what's the part of it that's boating on the coast, and in trying to get a finer and finer slice. And what I do know is that the closest we can get to is that $266 million are spent each year on boating and fishing recreationally on Maine waters. So that's as fine tuned as you can get it. But we're well aware that when people go out on the water, they buy their food, they will stay at a campground or maybe a B&B on one end or the other of their trip, and it's an economic engine like everything else. So Tom, let me kick it back to you. And you talked about, there are obviously some very real threats to the working waterfront, and I live in Portland near the water, and those buildings that you're talking about are things I see all the time. What's the Island Institute's perspective on tourism and outdoor recreation as a sector?
Sure, and just before I go there, I want to remind people to post questions in the Q&A portion at the bottom of your screen. Yeah, this is kind of a pet peeve of mine. I've been in Maine since 1983, the same year the Institute started, and Mainers tend to look down their nose at tourism. And, there's some basis for that. Hey, it's seasonal jobs. You can't support a family. They're temporary jobs, waitressing and housekeeping and so on. But that overlooks some real important facts. looked at this a couple years ago. Of Maine's 8 coastal counties, taxable lodging and taxable restaurant sales were $1.2 billion. That's obviously a big chunk of change. That's more than double the revenue that comes from lobster landings, even in these boom years. And there's this symbiotic relationship between tourism and the working waterfront. I mean, people want to sit and eat their lobster looking out at lobster boats landing or bobbing at their moorings, and not at mega yachts. I mean, that's what they come to Maine for. So it's an important segment of the economy. I asked the Maine state economist a few years ago what percentage of the economy is tourism, and she said you really can't break it down because, like Doug, if you and I go out to lunch in Portland, we're not tourists, but that's the taxable restaurant sales. But it's a huge segment. And I also think tourism brings people to Maine to become year-round residents. They fall in love and they stay. So it's important. There's been some kind of quirks to it in recent years. One of which is the Airbnb phenomenon. Some towns, particularly in southern Maine, have said we've got to stop these because people are realizing they can make more money renting even 15 weeks a year their home than they can from renting the house to a working family for the entire year. So that's squeezing out working people, and the housing costs are going up. I also think about the authenticity factor, which maybe I'll get to later too. But and I also think about Washington County, which I just, if you read The Working Waterfront, I have a soft spot in my heart for Washington County. And there's unless it's changed, someone check me on this, I don't believe there's a single chain motel or hotel in Washington County. And I think that hurts it. I think if you're sitting in New Jersey or New York and you want to visit, you've heard about east of Acadia and some great places to visit, you may not book a stay at the Bluebird Motel in Machias. As nice as the Bluebird Motel may be, you don't know what it's really like. Whereas if it's a Comfort Inn or a La Quinta or whatever, you're more likely to go there. And I think that would help. The one coastal county that has been struggling pre-COVID is Washington County. It has not realized its potential. And I think tourism is a good shot for it. And lastly, I'll say that, the Maine Office of Tourism works really hard with a relatively small budget to promote tourism. And I think we tend to be complacent about it. We think, hey, we've got vacation land on our lobster, on our license plates, that's good enough. And it's not. So we've been talking about recreation and work and the waterfront itself. And Doug, I'll ask you, you guys are very much involved in this. This is kind of, very much in your wheelhouse, the challenges and successes you've seen about public access to that water that we value so much.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's such a pertinent issue, I think, for everybody probably on the call, as well as both of us. Access to the water, you described that 20 miles that's being squeezed. I assume that 20 miles includes ramps and other means of getting onto the water. And everybody who owns a boat in Maine knows that those opportunities are few and far between. And it's interesting to me because our economic impact all passes through those ramps. That's the way people get to the water, whether it's on a bigger boat and they're going on a dock, or they're launching a boat, or they're hand carrying a paddling boat. It's all about access. And everybody in Maine enjoys, since colonial times, the ability to be on the intertidal zone for fishing, fowling, and navigation. Well, if you can't get to the intertidal zone, that right of all of ours is relatively worthless. So it's something really important that we think a lot about. And in the case of MITA, we also are quite concerned that include overnight access, because people want to go out to the islands and spend a night out there. It's a truly magical experience that very, very few Americans ever get to experience. But if every boat ramp has a sign that says no overnight parking, then it's hard to have that experience. So we are quite attuned to that. We also are really quite attuned to that some of the folks who are using this, there's a little bit of a conflict between the fishing community and the recreation community in this particular area, specifically these launching zones. And we try really hard to get our members to understand that the absolute worst thing that you can do is to, especially if you have out-of-state plates, is to pull up to a launch ramp with your kayak on your roof, block the ramp, and then take your time getting the boat down and then packing, and do I really need this? And oh, I forgot my cooler. And meanwhile, there can be boats coming from the water sheet or behind you on the ramp, and they are moving and they are at work. And if they are clammers, they are very dependent on the tide. And if you are blocking the way, you are going to be very unpopular very quickly. So we try really hard to drive home that launch ramp etiquette, as it were. Any other thoughts on, it's an interesting kind of a yin and yang, I think, that we're getting at here between sort of, the romance of the coast and the realities of the coast. Maybe anything more on that, Tom, from your perspective?
Yeah, it's funny. It reminds me of what a lobsterman friend of mine here in Belfast said. You know what we call kayaks speed bumps, but I think he was talking about on the water. But again, back to what I said earlier about the symbiotic thing between people want to see the lobster boats and eat their lobster dinner. But yeah, working waterfront communities, you have to respect that it's a vital part of the economy of those towns. And we did a story several years ago about Maine Sea Grant actually produced these little brochures about working waterfront communities. And if you picture someone, they come from, I'm from New York originally, so I'll pick on New York, come to Maine, say, you're telling your friends, we bought this beautiful place and you can see the harbor from where we live on our back deck and the lobster boats bobbing at the moorings. It's so picturesque. But at 4:30 in the morning, when the pickup trucks head on down past the house and the diesel boat engines fire up, and when you walk down on the pier and you have the smell of rotting bait, well, we can't have this. This isn't our vision of life as it should be, but that's the reality, and you're coming into this. So there is that conflict. So the Sea Grant created these brochures for Jonesport and Harpsil, as far as I know, maybe other working waterfront communities, and really kind of clever. And they gave them to realtors and said, when someone comes to your town and is considering buying a home, give them these pamphlets and say, which said, you are moving into a working waterfront community. So it kind of reinforces that. Another thing, which I think is really clever. I don't know if they still do this, Doug, you would know probably, but Portland had this Walk the Working Waterfront event every fall. And they got people, it was just open. So you could walk and walk around the traps and walk in places you otherwise were not welcome. Right. Just so you know it's there. So you learn something about it, which I think is kind of cool. This leads into, what are you guys doing as the Maine Island Trail Association to kind of enhance this quality of life that we all value so much for coasts and islands and visitors and residents?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. In my mind, I guess the first and foremost thing, of course, is that we created over 32 years now, the Maine Island Trail. And it started, like I had mentioned before, with 30 islands. We're now up to 241 sites along the trail. That includes islands and then also some mainland sites that kind of help to bridge gaps along the way. You talked about Washington County. One of our recent big pushes was to get the Bold Coast included on the trail, because there are lots of people who on small boats, including self-propelled craft, will try to do the Bold Coast in one fell swoop, and there were no bailout points, and that is a dangerous stretch of water depending on what day you hit it and what the tide is doing and the weather, of course. So we're really proud that along there we created in the past year 2 campsites that are only accessed by the water. So if you are a boater and you have any trouble or you just want to pace yourself, you've got two places where you can go ashore, and that was a big deal. That actually took a lot of work with the state. It's actually state property that created those campsites. And then I guess, so the Maine Island Trail is fabulous if you're a boater, but if you're not a boater, one of the ways that we can involve people is that we get people out to the islands to do stewardship work. And what we mean by that is basically cleaning up trash off of the islands. Even islands that are pristine on the upland side, with every tide cycle, they may get more plastic trash washing up. And to your point about sort of authenticity, you know, the sad reality is that is the authentic current Maine reality, but it's not the reality we want to project. So, and it's certainly not what we want to be doing to our coastal waters from a biological perspective. So we take trash off the islands. It's tons every year, mostly removed by volunteers, which is one of our real strong suits. We have many hundreds of volunteers who contribute thousands of hours of work each year to keep the islands and the surrounding waters clean. So those feel to me like things that we do to make Maine, you know, a special place. And I failed to mention before, I was talking a lot about sort of small boats, but it's important to recognize that within all this are bigger boaters too. And some of them come as cruisers from out of state. So this is a way that they can find their way very quickly from among the islands if they plan to sleep ashore or sleep on their boat and drop a hook. You know, it ends up being something that really is suited to boats of all kinds. And yeah, and we're proud of what we've built.
You guys were in that early. I mean, I was on Frenchboro last summer, and there was some nonprofit that's based out of Maine, cleaning and cataloging everything they found on the shore. But you guys have been doing that for years, which is really cool.
Yeah, no, it is. We occasionally have done censuses like that, and I think that was the Rosalia project.
Yes.
They do a very fine-tuned every single piece of trash, but we can take data from that effort and then expand it upon the entire sum of trash that MITA has gathered over the course of the year and give a pretty good indication of, you know, how many thousand drinking straws did we find on the islands, et cetera. You know, it's estimates, but it's pretty compelling.
I can just jump in here, Doug. I'm seeing that we're getting a bunch of questions. I'm being told that we're going to go to questions, but I just wanted to quickly mention, because I mentioned the word authenticity a couple of times. I do worry about Maine coast becoming, you know, does Bar Harbor become Newport? You know, that West Street, my wife and I were up there a couple of Januaries ago, that giant hotel complex, completely dark. It's a worry. And, you know, when I say authenticity, I think I mean the social and economic strata through a community. And I think that's something the Island Institute thinks a lot about is, you know, I picture someone on North Haven driving his friend a summer resident driving his friend from California around saying, that's the guy I buy my lobster from. That's the guy who takes care of my boat. She's the postmistress. There's my caretaker. And they like that. And I think we all want to see that. So with that, I guess we're going to go to, because we have the questions are piling up, which I'm very pleased to see. I guess we'll go to questions now. Madison?
Hello again. So thanks everybody for your questions, and thanks Tom and Doug for a great conversation. I think I personally got a lot out of it, so thank you for that. So I'm just going to be reading these questions in the order that they came in. And so the first one is, I think this one is mostly pointed towards Doug, but what are your feelings regarding the recent loss of Waterfront in Stonington with the sale of Captain Tom's kayak rental and school?
Yeah, Captain Bill, but yes.
Captain Bill, yeah.
Yeah, it's a huge loss to coastal access. It's, you know, it's one of those things where each little thing is just another kind of a little chink in the armor, or maybe that's not the right analogy, but yeah, it was really unfortunate that Bill Baker decided to retire and needed to get market rate for the property. And we worked pretty hard with the Maine Coast Heritage Trust and a couple of other nonprofits to try to figure out if there was something that we as the nonprofit sector could do to save Old Quarry and that waterfront access. And unfortunately, in the time that we had, which was less than a year, we were not able to get there. So it's something we are very actively talking about at MITA, is what people are going to do specifically to access Merchants Row.
Yeah. And so this question is going a different direction. How do you assess the impact, pro and con, of the cruise ship industry on the Maine coast?
Tom, I think that one's more you than me.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's, you know, there was a group in Rockland last summer that was very concerned about these giant cruise ships coming to Rockland. What we learned from observing the whole process is that municipalities have a lot of power to control what they, you know, what comes in and what doesn't. You can limit access. But, you know, I don't know. I also think about, we're not going to be out there on Route 1 blocking tour buses or RVs. You know, it's again, part of the tourism economy. Those smaller cruise lines, the American cruise lines, studies have shown that they spend far more money than the big cruise ships. Of course, COVID has changed everything. Portland in 2019 had 104 cruise ship visits, and Bar Harbor was more than that. I don't have the exact number. It might have been as high as 140 or more. It's an impact, but it's still very subjective, I think. I mean, I think municipalities can drive a harder bargain, saying you will come here, this is where you'll land, this is where you'll pump out, you will adhere to these regulations and so on. I think municipalities don't know how much power they have. And as far as the impact, you know, you walk down Main Street in Rockland, some people complain about it, and some people say, you know, I made a killing. My store got a needed shot in the arm. So.
Right. And if I can just chime in on that one, my understanding is that with these biggest cruise ships, and it's just amazing in Portland when these things come in, they are taller than the tallest buildings in Portland, and they are mobile. It's just bizarre. But those largest ones, apparently most of the passengers have paid for their meals. So you think that the restaurants are going to make a killing, but people are actually going back to the boat to eat because they already bought their lobster, you know, dinner for the evening. So I think it's kind of a hit or miss. Certain sectors that, you know, whether it's sort of arts and crafts and T-shirts and things, they'll make a killing, and then somebody else who you think would make a killing won't. And it's interesting.
Yeah, I wrote a column about Portland using the Yogi Berra quote, "Nobody goes there anymore, it's too crowded." And that's the fear, is that you can't walk on the sidewalks of Portland or Bar Harbor.
Right.
Moving along, we do have a lot of questions, so I'm going to try to get through as many as we can here. And so this one is, what is the importance of outdoor recreation to the social, health/fitness, and mental well-being of both Mainers and visitors?
That's Doug.
Yeah, I'll just say that it's something quite profound. And I say that as a boater and as an island camper myself. When you get out on the water, and boy, this is particularly true during COVID, when people are just desperate to get sort of away from people in a safe way. It's a really profound experience when you go to an island and you feel as though you're the first person who's ever set foot on it. And you just live simply, you have your good to go meal, and you boil some water, or you boil, back in the day, you could always find mussels and clams. Now that's less common these days. So, talk about sort of the authenticity and things that disappear. But still, I've had experiences on islands that are frankly close to being religious. And when you think about the Native American use of the islands for 12,000 years of Native American use of the islands before Europeans got here, it's hallowed ground, and you have to go to approach them in that way. And I think when you go in with sort of an open heart like that, you're rewarded for it.
A couple of weeks ago, I kayaked around Bartlett Island, which is just off the west side of MDI. I think the Rockefellers own most of it. It's just beautiful. I kept chasing a couple of eagles who kept flying ahead of me along the shore, and I saw a couple of pogie swarms, and yeah, it is just so great. And I'm going to plug one of Doug's films, because he won't, that you can do it in a small boat, which is, so many videos today are like 2.5, 3 minutes long. This is like 27, 28 minutes, but it's so good. It's just so like your 28-minute version of Zen, it's a beautiful little film. It's on YouTube, right?
It's on
Vimeo.
Vimeo, thank you.
Vimeo. Yeah, I recommend people see it. It's about that experience you're talking about, being out there in the water, especially by yourself. I think it is really profound.
Yeah. And I love that you were at Bartlett. We happened to have been there last week, and there are 3 MITA sites right along there. The Hub, Folly Island, and John Island, which are right in between MDI and Bartlett Island. It's
Sure.
gorgeous. That stretch is just gorgeous.
Yeah.
And so I guess this question is really for Tom. How do you see year-round communities on islands surviving the effects of climate change, particularly if warming waters affect the lobster fishery?
Yeah, it is frightening. This is something that the Institute spends a lot of time working on, and I'm sort of on the periphery of it. But I remember talking to Robin Alden maybe 5-6 years ago. She used to be the commissioner of the Department of Marine Resources, and she started Commercial Fisheries News, and she lives in Stonington. And she said, we are in a bubble. She also started what is now the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries, used to be Penobscot East Resource Center. And she said, the bubble's going to burst. And, you know, it's become a single species fishery, lobster. It is frightening. I went to this conference like they do every other year called the Beaches Conference in Southern Maine. And, you know, they're talking about presentations about managed retreat, and it's scary stuff. But it is interesting. I mean, the Institute works a lot on sea level rise stuff. I mean, Main Street in Vinyl Haven may be underwater. What do? Do you move downtown? I mean, it's a huge undertaking. But again, I'm not just tooting the Institute's horn, but these people I work with are really engaged in this in a big way. And I feel proud to see them do it. But God forbid the lobster. I mean, you look at the numbers, Zone A, which is from Schoodic to the Canadian border, accounted for something like 40% of the landings a year or so ago. And Zone, G, that goes from Portsmouth to, or Kittery to Portland, was like 4% and change of the land. So clearly the lobster are moving north and east to find colder water. So, you know, I don't know who's going to solve that problem. As Shelley Pingree said, we can't call up Canada and ask them for our lobsters back.
Yeah, and so this is kind of going off of that, actually. Besides buying locally, what can summer people do to support local fishermen and other full-time working residents?
Gosh, I don't have an easy answer for that one. That's a tough question. I think independent, you know, businesses are something to think about. I mean, I've seen it here in Belfast, well, Portland too, with all the booming restaurants, and then suddenly the restaurants are already closing. A couple of our favorites, I understand, at least one of them is closed for good, which is so sad. I don't know.
You know, I can take a stab at that, which if you're coming up to Maine for a vacation, purchase as much of your vacation related stuff in Maine as you can. So don't buy it on Amazon and get it shipped to, you know, your pair of moccasins shipped to you at home. Come up to Maine and go to L.L. Bean, which was an original founding partner along with the Island Institute of the Maine Island Trail, I should say. But in all seriousness, buy locally up here, buy your food up here. As people were coming up to quarantine for 2 weeks, a very common thing was, and in this case, they almost didn't have a choice, but it kind of brought it to my mind, was that people were filling a cooler of food in their hometown and then driving up to quarantine in Maine for 2 weeks. What a loss to the Maine, you know, markets to not be able to satisfy that demand. I mean, that's sort of a special COVID thing, but, you know, buy your boat in Maine, get it serviced in Maine, all that sort of thing.
Don't stop at the New Hampshire liquor store.
How do you feel about the trade-off between environmental protection and the protection of working waterfront communities? The lobster industry can produce a lot of sea trash, old lines, traps, buoys, elastic band packages, etc.
I can do a little on that one, and then you can chime in, Tom. But, you know, it is a reality that a lot of the material that we take off of the islands ultimately comes from the fishing industry. It's an unfortunate reality. One of the things that we're really excited about, and by the time it gets there, it's trashed. I mean, you know, storms and nor'easters and whatnot carry things ashore, and it's all beaten up. And even when we've tried to return what seemed to us like maybe a working lobster trap to a lobsterman, they just say it's junk, and they just, you know, it's gone by the time it's made it up on shore. But one of the things that we've done kind of quietly and is actually kind of fun, since 2015, MITA has started collecting buoys. We can tell when a buoy is still workable compared to not. And we return those to the harbor masters in various ports along the shore. And I just asked out of curiosity how many total it's been. And so far it's been 1,900 buoys that we've returned to the fishermen so that they can use it again. It's just, it's less of a waste, and it probably costs them $10 to buy a new one. So why wouldn't we do that? And it gets the plastic off the beach.
We had a story in our most recent paper about an organization, a small nonprofit called Traps to Treasure, based in Gouldsboro, and they're trying to recycle, crush and recycle metal traps and so on. But yeah, it's a problem. Oh, and back to the previous question, I just saw a note from my boss. Eat more lobster, she says, to help the to help local communities. Good point.
Maine lobster, not Canadian.
Absolutely.
And so here, sorry, I'm trying to prioritize and try to get in as many questions as we can.
Find an easy one.
Well, all right. Well, I'm going to do the opposite of that. What do you see as the long-term effects of the Harpsil shark attack?
Wow. Hopefully they will never be repeated. You know, it will never be repeated. It obviously, you know, an absolutely terrifying occurrence. And I feel like people are already learning different habits of, you know, where to swim and where not to, what to wear, etc. But boy, that was a terrifying wake-up call for everybody in Maine, of course. Tom, any other thoughts on it? It's no laughing matter. I will say, you know,
my wife and I go to Cape Cod in the sun. We have gone for summers and springs and stuff. And with the return of the gray seals, they've come back in great numbers there because of the Marine Mammal Protection Act. I remember standing on a beach in Chatham, seeing this whole pod of gray seals, and a woman walked up next to me. She said, "It's just a matter of time." I said, "What?" She said, "Before the great whites come." And of course they have. But there's certain things you can follow. I mean, they're in Cape Cod, they're tagging them. They're using drones to go up and down the beaches while people are swimming to look. But as I tell my wife, I think we're more likely to die in an accident on Route 6 on Cape Cod than we are, I mean, being eaten by a shark. I think you have to keep it in perspective. I still think it's rare. And it is awful, you know, the sharks are in Asia are caught, and the fins are cut off, and the shark tossed into the sea to die. So you'd hate to see that kind of reaction to it. It's a terrible thing, obviously, but it's still rare, I think. And I think it will remain. We'll probably see more great whites, no question, but I think it will still be a very rare occurrence, I hope.
Yeah, definitely. And so kind of switching back to working waterfront questions, what's being done to ensure people who work in the intertidal zone still are able to? You talked about ramps, but what about people from away who want a nice view, but people need to work on the water? What concrete steps are being taken?
Well, those court cases have gone up to the state Supreme Court. The seaweed harvesting case kind of threw a lot of people for a loop. The court ruled, the state's high court ruled that the upland property owners had control over the intertidal zone as far as access to the rockweed. And it'd be nice to see that settled once and for all, but the courts have been issuing very mixed messages. It's case dependent, I guess, on a lot of them, but I mean, most coastal states allow, you know, the public access is assumed, and but if the state were to make that move, you'd have a takings case. Everyone who owns shoreland property would have the biggest takings case you could imagine, claiming loss of value. So it's really a sticky question.
Yeah, I think we only have time for one or two more questions. And so can you address the impact of sea level rise on working waterfront and businesses?
I think we've kind of covered that, haven't we? It's access. I know there's a parking lot on Vinyl Haven that's downtown that the fishermen use to load gear onto their boats, and it's frequently underwater now. They can't park their pickups there. That's one. And we have pictures that we ran in our Island Journal 2 years ago that show structures on the waterfront, kind of fishing shacks where fishermen painted their buoys and so on. And they're underwater now at certain tides. And it's what they call a sunny day flood, where it's beautiful sunny day, no storm surge, but you have to walk in water up to your ankles to get to that fish shack. So it's having its impact.
Yeah, there are parts of Portland where it's not even the working water, it's not the shore businesses, it's Whole Foods.
Whole Foods.
A parking lot full of salt water. So it's getting in certain places beyond just the shoreline. And I would just say that, I feel like the world needs to be so many of the things we're talking about here, the migration of lobsters, the migration of great white sharks, et cetera. It's all about climate change. And you just can't overstate the potential. I run an island-based organization. Now, what could be more susceptible to climate change than that? But it surely doesn't stop with me. It's going to affect absolutely, any low-lying area, regardless of your industry, et cetera. And it's terrifying.
It is.
I have a great question for us to end on. So I'm going to go ahead with that one. So both of your organizations involve local Mainers as well as people from away. To what extent do you think, I'm sorry, I was reading it and it went away. Oh shoot, sorry. Okay, here, I found it. To what extent do you think that their personal connections to the natural world, what some call a connection to sense of place, enhance the work of your organization? How can your organization nurture that connection?
Boy, that's a great one. Tom, do you want to go first or shall I?
Well, we're working on some communications work too, and a phrase that we've been throwing around is like building community from the ocean up. And yeah, I think Mainers are very much outdoors people, and we understand the value of the natural world, and it does inform you, and it does make it harder to be. I grew up in suburbia on Long Island in New York, and you could just retreat into a house. I moved to Maine when I was 24, but people are just so much more plugged into their communities. And I think it's partly a function of the natural world that you can't, you get a blizzard and you need your neighbor to help plow your driveway out, or a tree falls across your road. I mean, we're just more plugged into it. And I think it instills community values. And yeah, I think it's that sense of place. It's so important, and I think it's threatened. And I worry about that I don't want Maine to become any place USA. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the good news is that when you're in Maine, you're in Maine, and that is still true. I love the question, a sense of place. I feel like in some ways that's the industry that I'm in, is creating a sense of place for people who want to, a uniquely Maine sense of place in a geography that exists in no other state in the US. There are thousands of islands off the shore that you can go and visit, and you cannot do that anywhere. It's just remarkable. Even as you get into southern Maine, the islands stop, as we know that they're few and far between down in York County, and they're gone by the time you get to New Hampshire. And Washington State has islands I'm blanking on the bay there, Orcas Island and the others. But there's just nothing like this, where it's a teeny little island that's an acre that you can go to and have an experience that is truly unattainable anywhere else. And that's what the sense of a sense of place in Maine is all about.
Yeah, every time I write, Maine is a special place, I feel like probably every place feels like their place is special. But then you stop and think about it. Maybe not. Maybe not everyone does think that.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, I'm not sure how we're supposed to end this.
Well, I was just going to say thank you to you both. I think that was a great question to end on. And thanks for an inspiring conversation.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this. And Tom, it's great chatting with you.
Yes, you too. This was a lot of fun. Thanks. Thanks everyone for showing up.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, thank you everybody for being here. It's really cool.
And yeah, you can learn more at both of our websites, which are listed on the screen there. You know, we'd love to connect with you.